Hello and welcome to
The Fantastically Terrible Podcast, Episode 27, The Invention of the African SubContinent. How many times have you heard the term Black Africa or the SubContinent? Africa is at a disadvantage by how we describe it. Northwestern Africa, also known as the Maghreb, includes Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia. North Africa is often removed from the continent or treated as fundamentally different from Black Africa.
Stick around until the end of the show to hear our
Fantastically terrible character or creature.
This week we'll look at hungry ghosts. If you commit the lowest of the low in evil acts while alive, it may cause your soul to be reborn as a hungry ghost. So let's get down to our topic today. Why is North Africa considered fundamentally different from the rest of the African continent? Why does the news and media constantly group North Africa with the Middle East in the so-called MENA region? The UN, the EU, the World Bank, the IMF all use the term Sub-Saharan Africa, even though they know it represents no valid statistical area. It only validates their perceived reality. It does, however, do four important things. It divides Africa in two. It makes the Middle East seem bigger and gives it a greater geographical importance. It pushes the real Africa, meaning the entire continent, further from Europe, even though they're neighbors with a long shared history along the Mediterranean. Right. And it also makes indigenous Africans subordinate to Arab culture, making, quote, Black Africans seem historically insignificant at best and undeveloped at worst.
It certainly does. Maybe at some other point we'll touch on how Middle East was also made up too.
That's a good point. Even the term Middle East is from a European or Western point of view.
Right.
Middle of what? On the way to Asia.
Well, it was from the British Empire, but that's a whole other different story.
That's a different story.
The idea of an invisible border which divides North Africa from the rest of the continent is rooted in racism.
Yeah, there's no getting around that.
There's no getting around it. The Sahara does not divide Africa. The country traded in prehistoric times, in pre-Roman times, and after the Arab conquest. Linguistically, Africa cannot be divided into North and South. Ethnically, it cannot be divided, not even by color or phenotype or characteristics, because of the diversity of the Amazigh people. And let's not forget that it completely ignores anyone in the Saharan part of Africa. Yes, there are people there. The Sahara area includes countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and Mauritania. Thus, they are neither sub nor North African.
That's right. And that's why we mentioned just before that statistically it's irrelevant.
Right.
As we mentioned in episode 12, Whitewash Part 1, From the Trojan War to King Arthur, during ancient antiquity, Romans, Greeks, Phoenicians, and earlier periods did not refer to race or color. For example, Romans sought an alliance with King Massinissa of Numidia in 202 BC to end the Second Punic War against Hannibal and the Carthaginians. Why? Because Rome needed their help to defeat the Carthaginians. Mm-hmm. No Arabs involved, indigenous Africans. They played an integral part in their own history, in Western history, in world history. Obviously, this was before the Arabs and before any notion of North Africa. As we mentioned in episode 12, Libya and Ethiopia, and these were ancient terms. The Greeks referred to a large section of North Africa as Libya. And also Ethiopia was often referred to in a broader African way.
That's right.
They're even in the Hebrew and the Christian Bibles.
That's right.
There's lots of references to Libya and to Ethiopia. They were always at the center of Western civilization. During episode 12, we also discuss how Black people feature prominently in Greek mythology. For example, during the Trojan War, the Trojans called on their relative, King Memnon. He was also the son of a Trojan prince and the goddess Eos. He wore armor that was forged by the god Hephaestus. He was renowned as one of the greatest warriors who ever lived, and he was on par with Achilles. After he was finally killed by Achilles in the Trojan War myth, Zeus made him a god, and he was worshipped by the Greeks and also the Romans.
Right.
So there was no distinction.
I think we don't understand that the Mediterranean is very fluid, and that there was a broad range of different phenotypes and hues of color. I think that what we want to think is Italian, Robert De Niro. Spain, Antonio Banderas. There isn't an average. And I think that once you understand that about the Mediterranean, whether you're looking at a place like Brazil, what's the average in Brazil, right? It's not going to be what the media
you can
presents
hold
you.
a picture of a Brazilian and I'll show you the opposite.
Right. You're dealing with mixed populations. So it's important to emphasize that these deeply embedded assumptions and stereotypes about Africa not only stand in the way of effectively learning more about the continent, but also have been the basis of ill-conceived academic research and policies. This is from AfricanExponent.com. 6 years ago, the Nigerian-born Chikia Onyani of the celebrated Africa Group argued that the term Sub-Saharan Africa is demeaning to Africa and must be rejected. He rightfully argued that there is no other continent that has sub-something. There is no sub-Europe or sub-America. We should be concerned that it's only the people who were considered as subhuman in history who are being referred to as Sub-Saharan Africans. The concept of some invisible border which divides the north of Africa from the south is rooted in racist thought. A black and white view of African culture only serves racist generalizations. There are more serious issues to be concerned with, but we cannot exclude identity and terminology from conversations on race.
Exactly. So who are the people of North Africa? The majority of people in this region and much of the Sahara refer to themselves as Amazigh. The plural of Amazigh is Imazigh, if I'm saying that correctly. The Amazigh people speak Tamazight. They make up a huge African ethnic group who are African, not Arab, and not Middle Eastern. They are the majority, not descendants of Arabs.
Right.
I'm going to avoid using the term Berber, which you see everywhere.
Right.
Since that's not what they call themselves. Traditionally, the term Berber is attributed to the Greek word barbaros, meaning barbarian. However, if you go to Wikipedia, I found this here, and I'll just quote it. Certain modern scholars have argued that the term only emerged around 900 AD in the writings of Arab genealogists. For example, Maurice Lenoir suggested that the term first appeared in the 8th or 9th century. Ramzi Ruigi argues that the use of Berber to refer to the people of North Africa appeared only after the Muslim conquests of the 7th century. Latin and Greek sources describe Moors, Africans, and even barbarians, but they never use the term Berber. The English term was introduced in the 19th century, replacing the old word that they used to use, which was Barbary, again from barbarian. So we still refer to them as Berbers, and it's again part of this when you use subcontinent, when you use sub-Saharan, when you use Berber, it's completely tied to their colonial past.
Just a quote again from AfricanExponent.com. What does it really mean in practice to say Sub-Saharan Africa? It is a way of saying Black Africa and talk about Black Africans without sounding overtly racist.
Yeah, I find it really bizarre when people will say, oh, in Black Africa. to distinguish it from North Africa.
I've had a lot of these.
And they don't say it in a bad way. It's so common. That's how you refer to it. And really, it has to end.
Yes, and I've had some really interesting sort of clashes on social media over that.
Mm-hmm.
And
because people don't realize. They say, that's just how we refer to that. But we refer to it that way for a reason. It is true that Arabs invaded North Africa in the 7th century. Of course. Mm-hmm. They colonized parts of the continent, but history didn't start there. All over Africa, we always say that's where humans came from.
Right.
Mother Africa, right?
Right.
There's a very advanced humans dating back almost 2 million years. Mm-hmm. There's cave paintings, there's advanced tools, evidence of farming, and yes, written texts. In antiquity, various African regions were highly advanced and an integral part of history. This was when the Amazigh ruled their own countries. So there were no Arabs. It wasn't an Arab influence.
Yeah,
it was their own kingdoms, their own cultures.
Right.
The Phoenicians were in North Africa and different areas around 900 BCE. The Carthaginians, who are native to modern Libya, then expanded their empire through the North African coast. The Romans came, and the Romans are where we get the name Africa.
Right.
The Romans established the province of Africa in 146 BCE after the defeat of Carthage. So the empire eventually controlled the entire Mediterranean coast of Africa, and they added Egypt in 30 BCE. Then there came the early Christians. Early Christianity arrived in the 2nd century and soon gained many converts. So the North Africa was very, very Christian. Mm-hmm. And in episode 13, Whitewash Part 2, The Dark Side of the Enlightenment, we describe 2 people, Origen and Augustine, who are indigenous African intellectual giants who helped form the early Christian church. And then there's King Mansa Musa, who is said to be the richest man who ever lived. He ruled the kingdom of Mali from 1312 to 1336, and his kingdom spread across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso. And if you've heard the phrase, from here to Timbuktu, it's because it was a huge center for education and for culture. And people from all over the quote-unquote advanced world would go there to share ideas. Now, Mansa Musa was Muslim, but he was not Arab. He was born in Mali, and his empire spoke a local Western African language called the Manding languages. Okay, so let's not confuse being Muslim with being Arab.
Right.
Which is another thing that they do.
I mean, there are Eastern Europeans who are Muslim but are not Arab.
Of course, absolutely. Right. Not every Christian is Italian Roman Catholic. So let's talk about some obvious facts. Arabs are not indigenous to Africa. Mm-hmm. Being Muslim does not make you Arab. Mm-hmm. And speaking Arabic doesn't exclude you from speaking a local language.
Right.
And as I've learned from my Muslim friends, you learn Arabic to read the Quran.
Right.
Just like Jewish people learn Hebrew. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean they speak it in their day-to-day language.
Right.
So these regions of North Africa, yes, they speak Arabic, but they also have their local language.
Right.
It was never erased through colonization.
Right.
And that brings me to another point that really bothers me, which is, in modern context, would you call someone from Hong Kong British? Would you call someone Irish British? Would you call Brazilians Portuguese? Would you call Mexicans or Peruvians Spaniards? Of course not. So why do we do that to North Africa? Why do we call it Arab when it is Africa?
Right. I think a lot of it has to do with Egypt.
Egypt is African.
But it has to do with the ownership of the Egyptian civilization. And what I mean by that is, it's such an amazing civilization that in order to hand it over to Africa, it means that all the things that they said, going back to the subhuman,
Right,
and all this
right.
other stuff. It then erodes all the big white supremacist lie.
Well, that'll probably be another episode we can look at
Right.
too. Is that Egypt is African, and in definitely colonialist British archaeologists, German archaeologists, different ones. They constantly found things that pointed to Africa, and they would ignore it and say, "No way, they couldn't have done that."
Yeah, they just made up whatever they wanted.
And then they would make things up.
Yeah.
So that could be another show, but you're right. They take possession, and that's what they do with terming North Africa and separating it from the rest of Africa.
Right.
You're not African.
Right.
Of course they're
It's
African.
the cleave.
And also that ideal that you said, where everyone looks a certain way. You know, I'll have links to many things, including photographs. You have everything from hair color, eye color, skin color, everything.
It has the most genetic diversity on Earth.
That's right. Africa has
You can
everything.
go from Watutsis, like these 7-foot guys, to pygmies that are like small. Like, I mean, it is amazing.
And contrary to what many believe, local Africans were not assimilated into Arab cultures. The various Amazigh cultures have suffered under Arab dominance.
Right.
They have been oppressed for their ethnicity and particularly their language. The Arab colonizers called the people, as we mentioned, Berbers or barbarians. So why in our modern day do we still use such overtly colonial terms only in Africa?
I think because it isn't European colonization.
Yeah, well, it's like we give them a free pass.
Yeah, it's like,
And
it's
it
not
works
European.
it works to benefit Europe as well, because then it reinforces that idea that you were talking about. Everything from Egypt to North Africa, anything that was built, any empires built by Africa have to be, oh, you couldn't have done that.
Right. This is from thisisafrica.me. The people indigenous to North Africa, quote, see their culture as Amazigh, not Arab. Amazigh culture is an African culture. There are many non-Arab societies and countries that are Muslim, but have their own culture. Senegal and Niger are overwhelmingly Muslim countries, but we accept that they are African countries. They are African forms of Islam that have developed in these societies. As well, likewise, in North Africa, there are Amazigh forms of Islam. Many Africans follow a religion that arrived through colonialism, whether this is Islam or Christianity, but they may not believe that this denies their ethnic identity.
Absolutely.
This dubious source of prestige is partially a consequence of Arab imperialism continuously and consistently painting Amazigh as backwards, pagan, and uncivilized, thus imposing shame in identifying as Amazigh. Taken further, this systemic attempt to destroy Amazigh identity and the Amazigh social group rewrites the history of North Africa by redefining the region as Arab Islamic, as part of the Arab world. Many outside the continent now believe this to be true, and so do many on the continent. So the PR offensive, brainwashing, whichever one you prefer, has worked.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. When I read this article, I was really blown away that it has so many psychological ramifications, and it literally erases the history before the Arab conquest.
Right.
If Europeans did that in South America, in Africa, and Asia, immediately they would be called out on that.
Well, yes.
So it's so interesting to
Imagine
me that we
after-
still carry these terms.
Imagine after World War II, everything that Europe had done was gone, and now it's all American here in Europe.
That's
Imagine
true.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, Europeans would be like outraged by it. So why we can't afford this to the people,
To this region.
To this region.
Yeah, no, I agree.
yeah.
Just because you have one country taking over another, think historically, think any country. Did the French cease to exist when the British Empire eclipsed them?
Right.
Did the Spanish culture go away because the French Empire eclipsed them?
Right.
This doesn't happen.
No.
You still exist under someone else's rule. and this is a little bit more from thisisafrica.me. Africa is one continent, a continent with a huge amount of internal diversity. The separation of the continent into Arab North and Black Sub-Saharan is not only divisive but false, misleading, unnecessary, counterproductive, and damaging.
Amen. Yes.
Of course, I'll have links to all of this on our website.
We read this from Quartz Africa and thought it was really interesting. Sub-Saharan Africa is such an enormous catchphrase that it's almost useless, says Rosalind Morris, an African Studies professor at Columbia University. Nigeria as a state doesn't look anything like Kenya as a state and doesn't look anything like Botswana. It makes no statistical sense. Sub-Sahara is too vast and arbitrary an area. It seems the purpose is to strengthen an imagined border between lighter-skinned northern Arab countries and the rest of Africa. The entire area has every color and characteristic known on the planet. From the north to the south, it is Africa. North Africa is not an Arab bubble that sits on top of a black country or continent. It is a ludicrous idea that comes directly from colonization, and it's dripping in racism.
Many of our largest global institutions and the media perpetuate the use of this terminology. For example, here's a headline from 2016 in CNN. Mark Zuckerberg makes first ever visit to Sub-Saharan Africa. That was the title. It should be Mark Zuckerberg began his first visit to Nigeria. Yes, Nigeria. Why do Western headlines say Sub-Saharan?
Right.
Do we say President visited South America? Or do we say he visited Brazil?
Right.
He visited Mexico.
Argentina. Colombia.
Do we say why do we say, and not just Africa, right? So they're not even lumping it as the continent. Why would they say Sub-Saharan? You know, I think it's worth noting that he didn't go to Sub-Saharan Africa. He went to Nigeria, which is the 7th biggest country in the world.
I just learned something new.
What?
It's the 7th largest country in the world.
It's really crazy that they use these terms. Mm-hmm. They don't, even if they said he visited Africa, that's very general. But why say Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, it's because that's subordinate.
Exactly. It's the use of that word sub, and they do it all the time. There's also a UN development program, and it lists 46 of Africa's 54 countries as sub-Saharan. They excluded Algeria, Djibouti, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Somalia, Sudan, and Tunisia, which does not make geographical sense because 4 of those countries are on the Sahara. And Eritrea, which is deemed sub-Saharan, is south of there. So it's all mixed up. The UN itself will list countries as sub-Saharan, and even by their definition, they're either Saharan or they're not. That's why we continuously mention, statistically, it does not make sense.
No, you look at the map, right? And I know a lot of people sometimes will say things like, you know, Africa's made up of a whole bunch of different countries. There's 54. Yes, but that doesn't mean they don't interact.
Well, that's a whole other thing, of course.
Which is insane.
Of course. It's really nuts. So we use this vague term, sub-Saharan, that people, even institutions who use the term, they cannot agree on what countries are included. And it doesn't make any geographical sense. So why do we still use it? Again, it's political. It's tied to colonization, and they really need to stop it.
Yeah, they really do. Again, this is from Quartz Africa. The term spread as a replacement for the racially tinged phrases tropical Africa and black Africa that were used until around the 1950s, says a Columbia University anthropologist, Brian Larkin.
You know, I'll just interrupt. I still hear people say black Africa.
Yeah, I always thought they were just being ignorant. But now I understand that that was actually a term that was used. I usually kind of thought, oh, you're from a small town, aren't you? You know. The dividing line itself also has some troubling origins in what Larkin calls racist colonial theories that thought Northern Africa more culturally developed.
So it again follows what we were saying, where anything that was indigenous to Africa, they just ignored it.
Yeah.
And they kind of recreated Africa.
Quote, it divides Africa according to white ideas of race, making North Africans white enough to be considered for their glories, but not really white enough. Professor Mashanda, a politics and international affairs scholar at Wake Forest University, wrote earlier this year for the Africa Exponent, quote, it is a way of saying Black Africa and talking about Black Africans without sounding overtly racist, unquote. Totally true. I mean, like, really. Now, one diaspora group found the phrase so disparaging and contemptuous, it launched a 2010 petition to abolish it, but found scant success.
And this I'm going to quote from ebonyintuition.blogspot.com. Historians would like to point to the unilateral influence on African culture by non-African people. Never is Africa seen to be the givers of cultural influence outside of its locality. This was extended to the extreme to say that Nubians offered nothing to a supposedly Caucasoid Egypt. This impossible assertion means that for thousands of years, there was only a unilateral cultural and technological exchange. No culture in history shows a unilateral exchange. Not even the Great British Empire, which dietary culture has been completely altered in a mere 20 years by Asian and Caribbean immigration. There is also the notion of other, suggested in ancient Egyptian writings, which is now being used to suggest they were of a different race to the Nubians. Lopsided scholarship will always try to work outside of the established human behavior. When Ethiopian art depicts the people of southern Sudan, there is an artistic difference how Ethiopians paint themselves and how they paint other Africans. This doesn't mean that Ethiopians are not African. Ghanaians do the same thing. Ethnic differences do not mean racial differences. Well, in Egyptian art, the women are often painted lighter than the men. It doesn't mean every Egyptian woman was lighter. It's just an artistic way of representing, I guess, the feminine.
Plus, a lot of the Egyptian art that we see is all the cleaned up Victorian stuff. Because there's a lot of stuff, erotic art, that just did not make it to... Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that just did not make it to the museum shelves.
Wouldn't it be, you just raised a good point. Imagine all the information we could have that's locked away somewhere.
Right. But, just think about how puritanical and Victorian all these people go and they're seeing this Egyptian stuff. Like, we see the Roman stuff from Pompeii, and there's some pretty raunchy stuff there.
Yeah, it's true. It's tied together. Of course, any colonial empire will do this to the people that they're ruling over.
Right.
They'll take over. They say that they're the superior culture. It happens everywhere all the time. But it did benefit the British Empire to have these hierarchical levels.
Right.
Right. That's where this came from. Of course, we always look at the Nazis and how they had a list of what's the lowest race all the way up to the perfect race. That's what it was like. It wasn't just the Germans, the British, the Americans. They had this eugenics idea.
Right.
And they continued that. So they were fine with having the North being lighter, the rest of Africa being darker, because it fit into their racial hierarchy.
And we're also pumped in with this idea that somehow through time we improve, we get better. The stronger culture wins, the smarter culture wins.
But they make it seem like the more intelligent culture wins.
Yes. The Greeks were far more intelligent than the Romans.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Romans were more military.
And the Romans were
organized.
a bunch of brutes that went and destroyed Greece and conquered them. So it's not necessarily about who's the brightest. It's sometimes who's the most ruthless that has to be considered here. And that doesn't enter into that.
Well, I guess what I meant to say was the reason we still have this is not just because the Arabs have some conspiracy to keep it like that. The British then continued it because it suited their purposes. Europe, I shouldn't just say the British, but in Europe, it coincided with their ideas during colonization. This has to stop.
Well, and it's interesting because some of the archaeologists, when they first got there and they started to see these, I guess you could say, paintings or drawings of brown and black people, some of them said, if they built all this, if black and brown people built all this, then what we did by enslaving these people is horrifically wrong.
Well, as time passed, the justification for slavery and the slave trade was we're superior to them.
Right.
And that goes away when you acknowledge that, no, they had empires. They had kings that were the richest, like the king of Mali.
Right.
Mansa Musa. Everyone in Europe knew who he was.
Right.
They had kingdoms that were as rich as the European or even the Asian empires.
Right.
There was no dividing line. There was none.
There
this
never
came
was.
later. This came later.
Even with our one episode that we talked about, Eurasia, it comes back to the same thing. This dividing line between Asia and Europe. No,
there is none. It's one continent.
It's one continent.
Right. Even geography, how geography is taught. In North America, in Canada and the U.S., we're taught that there's the European continent, the African continent, the Asian continent. In Europe, they're taught Eurasia is a continent. Yeah. They're not taught that they're two separate continents.
Right. Yeah, there is actually a road that connects from Africa. You can walk from Africa, from Northeast Africa, all the way up to Russia, which is wild. I mean, so ultimately, this whole idea of continents is very politically, and geography is very politically charged. And it's done in such a way to sort of shape the way that we view the world.
That's right. That's absolutely right. If you look at a map of the world, Africa, through the Middle East, is connected.
Yes.
You go Africa, you go into wherever. You can go into Jordan, you can go into Saudi Arabia, you pass into Iran, Turkestan, all the way to Russia, all the way to Asia. It's all connected.
To let you know, the Mongolians made it all the way to Egypt.
That's right.
And they
walked right through. They didn't sail.
They had horses. They just crossed over. And
so these divisions are really ridiculous. They did not exist. And I'll put a link. We just found a map now, and I find it very interesting because, again, they're dividing North Africa and its connection to the Middle East and to Asia. But they don't include the coastal towns of Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Ethiopia, which can easily pass into Yemen.
And Ethiopia is critical because Ethiopia
is in every history that you read.
History of the Bible.
As I mentioned, they're in the Trojan War.
they're in the Bible. The first convert is to Christianity.
That's right. The apostles' first conversion to Christianity was an Ethiopian.
An Ethiopian eunuch. And, Christianity in Ethiopia has a long tradition.
That's right. So it's very interesting that if you look at a map, they love carving out North Africa. And even in this context, this map is showing the connection between Africa and Asia. And it's purposely leaving out countries that are connected because they're considered sub-Saharan.
Right.
Which is ridiculous.
Which is nuts because, the Fulani have been known to go from Egypt all the way to Nigeria. Yeah, because they're nomadic people.
It's it's an imaginary line that was drawn to suit colonial powers.
And I think that, and I've had this issue with people who I've interacted with on social media, that they look at the borders, say Mali, whatever, and they think, okay, everybody stays in their little neighborhood.
I noticed that more recent updates to Sub-Saharan is calling it the African Transition Zone.
Yeah.
But it's the same fake border.
Yeah.
That makes no sense at all. And who cares what you call it? You're dividing the continent to make it seem less cohesive.
Those old colonial eugenic ideas are so deeply ingrained in academia that if they're broken, we have to reimagine the world differently. But the laziness and the narcissism that's behind this whole idea of having the North being white and the South being black, I guess you could say Europeans can still say, well, they're not black, right?
Exactly. It's horrible.
So in summary, I feel that we have to, when we see maps, when we hear these things, question it. Think logically. Look, see what the cultures are. Are there nomadic cultures? Because there's a lot of old hangovers from colonialism and the eugenics thinking.
Especially with Africa.
Especially, yes.
And so if you hear African transition zone, that's the same BS.
Yes.
There is no transition
zone. It's just
zone.
Repackaged, resold to you, remarketed.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a rebrand.
And it's bad enough that, as I mentioned, headlines will say, oh, they visited Sub-Saharan Africa. Why not just mention the country they're visiting? Why is that so difficult?
Right. It's just how about west, east, north, south? Done.
Like anywhere else.
It's insane. It's just, it's not insane. It's actually done on purpose, which makes it worse.
Perhaps the best way to end this is just to be aware of the subtlety of language.
I agree.
And how language can influence your view of a country, of a culture, apparently of a whole continent.
Of a people.
Now, if you want an example everyone knows, think of the book 1984. Language can be used to alter your opinion about something, your view of something.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, it really is being used on a massive scale against the largest part of Africa.
Well, it's also used to take away from people their
language. It erases their contribution to world history.
Yeah. It's a form of psychological colonizing.
Yeah, that's a good point. It never stopped being colonized.
That's right. The fantastically terrible character or creature this week are hungry ghosts from Buddhist legends. Hungry ghost is one of the 6 modes of existence. Hungry ghosts are pitiable creatures with huge empty stomachs. They have tiny mouths with necks that are so thin they cannot swallow, so they remain hungry.
It reminds me of like a level of Dante's Hell.
There's probably a few Bezos going to be hanging out there at some point.
Could be. Well, if you read why, it could be.
Hungry ghosts are also associated with addiction, obsession, and compulsion. How do you become a hungry ghost? It's believed that hungry ghosts can arise from people whose deaths have been violent or unhappy. Other stories point to desire, greed, anger, and ignorance are all factors in causing a soul to be reborn as a hungry ghost, because there are motives for people to perform evil deeds.
Right. So too much desire, too much greed, too much anger can lead you to do evil things. And you will be a hungry ghost.
So I wasn't too far.
You were not too far off. Many schools of Buddhism leave food offerings on altars for hungry ghosts. In the summer, there are hungry ghost festivals throughout Asia that feature food and entertainment. I'm sad to say I was unaware of this really popular month-long festival, and I wish I knew about it because a month of ghost stories sounds fantastic. I mean, I love Halloween. Doing that for a month sounds incredible. It's usually the 7th month on the lunar calendar. They call it Ghost Month. Did you know about this?
No.
This is fantastic.
No.
I wish I knew about this. It reminds me of the Mexican Day of the Dead, which they celebrate on November 1st and November 2nd. And it coincides with All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. The Hungry Ghost Festival takes place every year. So you have the Ghost Month.
Right.
And then you have the Hungry Ghost Festival.
Interesting.
That takes place on the evening of the 15th day of Ghost Month. In 2021, if you want to mark it on your calendars, the Hungry Ghost Festival is on August 22nd.
You mentioned that it reminds you of the Day of the Dead, and that's because the component of this festival is also to celebrate one's ancestors.
It's to celebrate your ancestors. It's to connect with people who have died. And because hungry ghosts can cause mischief and can cause problems for you, that's why they leave food for them.
Right. And it can also be, hungry ghosts can also be family members that have been forgotten. Ancestors.
Yes, it's many things come together. It's sort of to protect you from them, but it's also to remember them. If you don't remember them, you could also become a hungry ghost.
Interesting.
So it's all tied together. If you're too greedy to give them something, if you don't appease them, you could have the same fate. So it really ties together with ancestry, with family, a little bit of, superstition and fear of the dead. It's a broader idea, just like with the Day of the Dead, where it's a time of year when the gates of the dead are open.
Right.
And
but it's for a whole month, not a day.
It is.
Wow, they took like Catholic guilt like just that much higher.
I find Buddhists are the Catholics of the East when it comes to
but like
guilt.
on the max. We only got a day. I mean, they got a whole month.
My Jewish friends are like, wait a minute, what about us and the guilt? It's like, yes.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's it for today. 7 Robots, Fantastically Terrible. Podcast is by Miguel Guerra and Susie Diaz and written by Susie.
We want to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoy our show, that's fantastic, but not terrible. No. If you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, please do. It really helps us with our statistics on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. If you go that extra mile and leave a comment, we'll be able to see your name and personally thank you live on the show. For more information on this episode, including links to everything we've referenced, please visit our website at www.7robots.com/podcast.
And remember to check out Ghost Metal, our free comic on Webtoon and now on Tapas. Or tapas if you're Morris Moss. Read each week as we serve you bite-sized sci-fi and horror stories on a macabre menu of detestable delights. A new episode is up every Friday for your abhorrent amusement. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.